So in this VOD review, I'm going to talk about like specifically Brawl and like understanding how to hold chokes and pushing through chokes. Um, it's going to be it's going to be really focused on maybe teams that have Mei, because I think understanding how to like actually abuse Mei and hold chokes is really important. And also understanding how to like push through chokes, right? When you have Mei and the enemy team has Mei is really important. And also how to push through chokes if you don't have Mei and the enemy team has Mei. Okay, but before we do that, we're going to talk about like something that's really important and really basic, right? Is sort of understanding, what are the different types of chokes. There we go. Let me also move something before I forget. Put that over there. So there's a hard choke, and there's soft chokes. Okay. Hard chokes, essentially the way to think about them, right, is there's only really like one way to go through. And essentially like they're not very wide. And they're sort of like they're long, they're medium in like width, or no, we mean like in length. Like they're sort of long but not too long. And the reason why this matters, and I'll show you an example in a second, is because it sort of squishes the team in and they can't really move around. Now, soft chokes, right, is a bit different, where essentially they have like multiple different ways. Wait, did this thing get in the way? Let's see. Okay, it didn't get in the way. Put it over there. Sorry. Multiple different ways, like to go through. And like, I'll give you an example in a second. But there's basically just multiple different ways to go through, right? Maybe it's like really wide, so you're not really scared of Mei walls anymore. Or like maybe it's like not long at all, just really short. Okay, so let me give some examples. So the first thing I think of a hard choke, right? A very, very big example of a hard choke is Kings or Arches. I don't know how many teams have ever, had a team, a defending team play right over here, right? And they've just like struggled to really get past this, right? Like it's just actually cancer. It's like so annoying. Like how do you deal with this? This is just like really annoying and I hate it, right? So we'll sort of like talk about that and sort of how to deal with that situation, right? That's an example of a hard choke, right? Another example, right, is Hanamura, right? Like if you look at this again, hard choke, right? Like the defensive team maybe playing like over here or over here, right? Wherever, like their core, right? And they're, maybe got a Mei somewhere hiding. Maybe their core is over here and the Mei is over there, right? Like who knows, right? But the concept is like this is a really pain in the ass to get through, right? And if you're playing Brawl Mirror and we're mainly focusing on Brawl Mirror, right? How are you gonna deal with this? Because as everyone knows, neutral the first fight is really important, and if you win the first fight, it's great. You build ult advantage, you can maybe steamroll, right? Let's look at a soft choke example. A good example is here, I think. Wait, no, here. Oh, no. Here we go. Hollywood B, right? So the reason why this is a good example is you've got multiple different ways of approaching this. So there's a choke here, right? Choke sort of there, right? I think, right? But the concept is like your team, right? Like you can push through here, but you can also go through here. You can also go through here. You can also go through here, right? So there's a bunch of different like ways of going about it, right? And you can sort of like rotate a lot easier. And we'll sort of talk about how to deal with hard chokes. Primarily focus on hard chokes. That's what's really like annoying and like hard to deal with. So we'll talk about how to like push through them and how to properly hold them. Okay, so that'll be like the main focus of this, and this will really, in my opinion, this should help teams like get really good at like hopefully like having just strong holds and like winning fights off just straight up Mei walls, right? And eventually, if you get really good at this, you can take this to the next level, and you can just try to understand how to spawn hold. I'm not going to talk about spawn holding too much right now, right? But I think spawn holding is something that's really fun and like really interesting, and I definitely want to at some point. Okay. So the next thing I'm going to quickly like describe really fast is there's a small difference, okay, before we go into like actually understanding how to set up, right, on hard chokes. There's a small difference between, one corner situations and two corners. Okay, so what do I mean by this? Well, I'll just give quick examples. Here, in this situation, you actually have two corners. You have a corner right over here, right? You also have a corner over here. This means that somebody can play here and somebody can play here. So you essentially have two corners, right? I'll give you an example that has one corner. This is an example of maybe your team maybe playing this corner, like your team is playing back here. Whoops, get a different color. Your team is playing over here, right? There's only one corner. There is no other X place, your team can play or someone can play, right? So it's a one corner situation, which means, we're talking about it soon, but like it means that essentially you're probably going to be stacked more so, right? Or maybe you have to find another angle somewhere else. Okay, cool. So let's actually first talk about one corner before we go into two corners, because one corner is very simple, right? If you're holding like point control and you're playing one corner, right? In general, your team is probably going to be stacked, right? And you'll understand why like angles are really important later. But you do sort of want angles sometimes. So maybe sometimes you'll find if you're just one corner, maybe you'll have someone like up here off angling, right? Maybe you'll have someone maybe like in this angle over here, sort of off angling, right? Or yeah, so you can maybe like abuse high grounds or like maybe like other positions for off angles by maybe your diva. Maybe Lucio can try and get boops depending on like the map, right? It just sort of depends, right? But in general, like you're gonna have your Mei stacked with your Reinhardt, and that's what's really important to understand is that your Mei's probably still gonna be stacked with your Reinhardt. Now two corners. Now this is where stuff gets a bit more interesting, and I'm gonna use Eichenwald as an example to hopefully help like to teach this. So I had like a lot of discussions with like a lot of like owl coaches, and I also have like my knowledge from like TI when like TI used to run sort of Brawl and the May Cree comp, and we would just do really well with it when we were running Lucio Brig, and we would just like we're really good at choking people, right? That's what we were strong at. So essentially, like what I want to talk about is sort of the basic understanding. So the basic understanding, first of all, is that there's two different ways to look at this. You can have your Mei sort of stacked with your core, or you can have your Mei sort of on like split in an off angle. And each of these have like pros and cons, and we'll talk about why they have pros and cons and sort of how the enemy team can sort of abuse it and like how you can get value. The first thing we're going to talk about is how a Mei can sort of be split off in an off angle, because I think that's a lot more, it's more interesting and more difficult. Okay, now when you're doing this, right, there are two things, okay, that are like really important you understand when you're doing this. The first thing is your Mei needs to play in a position where that if you get walled, you can sort of easily get out. So for instance, if there's, I'm just gonna like try and show this. There's an opening right over here, right? An opening here, there's obviously an opening here, okay? So for instance, if your Mei plays somewhere over here, like sort of like right here, right? If the enemy team decides to wall the Mei, we're gonna use light blue, wall the Mei right over here, right? The Mei can then just say, hey, okay, cool, you walled me. I'm gonna come right over here, and then they can counter wall. Right? So your Mei plays in a position where like if you do get walled, you can counter wall, right? And that's even if you're scouted, okay? And we'll talk about scouting in a second too. The second thing, right, is trying to have your Mei as close to your core as possible, because if your Mei is close to your core, if the enemy team some reason pushes your Mei or someone goes on your Mei, your core will be able to peel for your Mei. So for instance, let's say the core is like playing over here, which is a little awkward, right? We'll talk about why how core should set up and where core should play, and I'll specify who's in the core. So the core should be trying to find a good color. It's nice purple. Here we go. So the core should always be defined as like Ryan. Diva is close to the Ryan, but not like fully on top of the Ryan. The Diva can like off angle a little bit, but he's be close enough to help, right? Your other DPS, whether it's like McCree, Reaper, right? Your DPS can be here unless the DPS is flanking, which you could do, right? And then your BAP, right? And your Lucio can be with the core, but your Lucio should sort of be in a position where he's like looking for boops if possible. Okay, so like this is the core, right? This is sort of your Lucio, and then your Mei can either play with the core, right, or it can be like split. So right now we're seeing the split example. So sort of how this works, right, and the general concept for this is that if the enemy team, first of all, doesn't even scout the Mei, right, doesn't know the Mei's here, what they'll do maybe is they'll assume the Mei's with the core, wall off the core, right, walk through, and then your Mei will counter wall them, and then since you walled second, right, your core will push through the wall and just kill them, right? That's like the basic concept, right? And that's sort of them just not being smart because they didn't scout, right? And the other way of also looking at this, right? And I think the best way to go about it is to say like, where is this weak, and like, how can you counter this first, right? Because I think if you understand, where it's, can be countered and why it isn't done all the time, you can then say like, okay, cool, like, I understand where it can be strong as well. So the cons, right, for this is, first of all, like I said before, is the enemy team really good at scouting? So like, if the enemy team is really good at scouting, we're gonna remove this. Come on, get off. We're gonna use red actually. So number one, if the enemy team is really good at scouting, right, then essentially what can happen is that they can do a few things. They can make a mini dive with their D.Va or Lucio, right, to go push your Mei. And when they do that, they send the D.Va Lucio on your Mei, right? They can then essentially have their core push into your core. And then what happens here is when their D.Va Lucio push into your Mei, that might force your Meis to cryo before your Mei even gets a wall off. And if that happens, right, then this could be really bad because your Mei then essentially can't wall off. The enemy team can push through the choke, right? And their Mei then could essentially like choose to wall off your core too, and then their core could push your Mei, and your Mei just sort of dies. So, or maybe if your team is really good at this, what should happen is, if your Mei sees the D.Va Lucio push, right, your Mei then looks to wall off, the choke, right? Your Mei looks to wall off the choke, and then essentially your core then looks to sort of like try and help your Mei and peel off the D.Va Lucio, right? At the same time, at a really high level, the D.Va Lucio can also just sort of fly in, right? Be a bait the wall and not even push in, and then you have no wall, and then you're sort of in a predicament. So this concept of like the enemy team using D.Va Lucio to sort of like, pressure your Mei into cryo and whatnot is like, you have to be a bit careful about it because the enemy team could be really smart. Obviously, you have your own D.Va Lucio, and your own D.Va Lucio could try and peel and help your Mei, and that work as well. Okay, but this only works, by the way, if the enemy team scouts your Mei. Okay, the other thing that I want you to understand with this concept, right, is when they send their D.Va Mei to go on your Mei, right, what's essentially happening is they're basically doing a D.Va plus Lucio versus Mei, right? And then they're also doing a Ryan, Mei, whatever their DPS is, right? BAP versus a Ryan, D.Va, your DPS, BAP, Lucio. Now the question you have here, right, is this straight up is a 2v1. Below here is a 4v5. So the real question here is, sure, can this buy time? Can you get time out of this, right, if they actually push you with a D.Va Lucio, for that your 5v4 to win, right? And your 5v4 essentially is the question of, does your D.Va plus Lucio do more than their Mei in the fight in a certain time limit? And if it does, right, then you can still win that, right? But it's sort of the question of how clean you are as a team. One thing I really want to express is that when you're playing Brawl and you're holding chokes, a lot of this comes down to how clean you are with scouting, with, setting up, using like, cooldowns like really timely, and then understanding, oh, we did this cooldown, we need to push instantly. So how good you are with the triggers, with what you do. Okay, so this is like a very simple way of like how the enemy team could try and counter you, right? The other way they could try and counter you, which is really sort of risky and honestly sort of dumb, is they could be like, okay, the Mei's over there, right? Let's quickly, what they could do is they could wall off the core and 3, 2, 1 speed into the Mei and force cryo on the Mei before the Mei has time to counter wall, right? But that's like not that great, right? So in essence, those are sort of the two ways, right, where they can counter the Mei. So the pros now, as you can probably see, is that if you can deal with this like D.Va Lucio push, right, and you sort of are like really like good at understanding how to win that 5v4, you're gonna win that. The other pro is if they don't scout you well, you're gonna get great walls that your core will push off of it. And the other pro that I'm gonna show up also is that you've got angles. There's a very big difference between, having everyone stacked in one position, right, versus having multiple angles and being able to pressure people, right? If Orion walks through a choke and essentially is forced to look one way here, he's like, his shield's like that, right? Use a different color. Orion's walking through here, and his shield's like this, right? And he's looking at the enemy team, and all of a sudden an enemy DPS sort of pops in here and starts shooting him from the side. Now that Ryan essentially has to start turning his shield around, right? And he's gonna be like forced to like look left, look right, and like he's gonna be it's gonna get really hard for him, right? And at a really high level, if you just think about it, Ryan players when they're pushing through, I'll use red again. Pushing through, if they're sort of like this, right, and they're getting pushed from forward, side, left, it makes it really, really, really hard for them to deal with it, right? Like that. That's just like what do they do? Like they can't look, they can't deal with all those angles. It becomes very hard, right? And obviously, what ends up happening is the defensive team has to sort of send resources to try and force those people out. This is sort of called pinching, but yeah. Okay, so right, so now we sort of talk about the pros, right? Like if they don't have good scouting, you understand how to deal with this diva push, right? If you're really good timing wise, right? It's really strong, right? And also the biggest thing I want you to always remember, right, is you need to understand that like your Mei needs to be in a position where if your Mei does get counter walled, right, your Mei can try and get another wall, right? Your Mei can sort of like back up and get another wall. Also, your core is ready to like kite if needed, right? Like your core is ready to back up if needed, so they don't get run on and get 65'd. Okay, so this is an example of, very straight up, right? Like, two corners, you may split with a core, right? Two, very simple. But in general perspective, you don't always need to do this, right? Like this positioning for core, and we'll talk about how you want your core to position and like what side and whatnot in a second. But in general, you could also just have, your team sort of play over here, right? And have your Mei stacked here, and maybe have your Lucio sort of chilling over here looking for a boop into your team, and then maybe have like maybe your Diva off angle, right? Because your Diva's got jets. They push Diva, Diva just flies away, right? Still got the angle, it's a bit safer, right? Because Diva's got jets, and Diva can still maybe support the Ryan as well for an off angle. So, and apply pressure. So now if you think about what happens here, if the enemy team pushes forward, right, then what's going to happen is they're going to have to deal with, let me get the Diva back. They're going to have to deal with, a Lucio there. They're going to have to deal with the core coming in here. They're going to have to deal with Diva there, right? Essentially, they're going to have to get pressed by 3 different angles, and that's really, really, really annoying to deal with. Okay. So it's okay to stack if you want to. So 1 second here. All right, let's talk about like what side is your core play and what side is like the Mei play if you wanted them to be split. And like the biggest thing I'm going to say here is, and the thing that's pretty much I haven't said yet, is that you need to take into account, right? You need to take into account essentially where your core is sort of like what's good for your core, like what's good for your core, right? And what's good for your Mei. And the biggest thing you need to realize, right, if you put your core over here, for instance, where if your core gets pressed and they need it back up, where are they kiting to? They're kiting to over here. If your core gets pressed over here, where are they kiting to? Over here, right? So wherever your core is playing, they need to make sure that they're kiting they're in a position where they can kite, right? Likewise, right, you don't want to put your Mei in a position where your Mei is sort of just stranded if you kite, right? If you let's say you put your core now. Let's say you put your core over here, right? And you put your Mei over here, right? If your core backs off, your Mei is stranded, right? And that's why also when you do these split plays, right, you're sort of committing more on these chokes. You're looking to go harder, right? But if your Mei and core is together, right, and you want to kite, it's safer because now you don't have to worry about it, right? Like, for instance, you saw before the split where you sort of saw the core plus Diva, right? In this situation, if your core is pushed, your core backs up, your Diva just flies away. It's safe, right? So if you want to play slower and you sort of want to like live more, right, and you know that you might need to back up because the enemy team might ult or something, then maybe putting your Diva on the side is better, right? And it's safer. Okay. And I'll say this very clearly, right? If they don't have a Mei, there's no reason for your Mei to off angle, right? Like just think about it. Like why would your Mei off angle if they don't have a Mei? You might as well keep your Mei with your core, so your Mei is safe now, right? And then just put your Diva or someone else here. Maybe put a Reaper there because Reaper can Wraith, right? So keep that in mind, right? If they don't have a Mei, right? Sorry, drinking some milk. If they don't have a Mei, you don't necessarily need to split like that. There's just no need to. Okay. So we talked about 1 corner point control. We talked about 2 corner point control. Hopefully that should, make sense. I'm trying to see if there's any nice examples. Okay, I think we're talking about retakes now. Yes, we're gonna talk about retakes now, and I have some great examples for retakes. Okay, so retakes. We're gonna try and keep this pretty simple. For retakes, there's a few things you need to keep in mind, and we're definitely gonna do a numbered list. And it's not gonna be as scuffed as the one before. And we're gonna go to a different map. I think we go to a different map. Let's go to King's Row. I think this is the most popular retake here. Yeah, this is the most popular. I think everyone is in my opinion, struggled with this. Okay, so we'll use blue. The first thing, right, is if we're retaking, right, we need to scout. We need to understand where their core is, because that is where their core is, their Ryan, and their core is denoted by where their Reinhardt is. So if you know where their Reinhardt is, whoops, let's rewrite this way. If you know where their Ryan is, right, you normally know where their core is, unless their Ryan's going for a flank shatter or whatnot. Hence, always again why you want to know where Ryan is, right? You want to know where their Mei is if they have a Mei, so you can understand how to deal with it, and we'll talk about that in a second. And you want to know about any DPS flankers. DPS flankers, if they have any DPS flankers. Okay, so that's what you need to scout. So now there's a few situations, and in terms of how we deal with this. If you've got a Mei, right, and they've got a Mei, again, you just need to understand how to first scout and take the scouting information and deal with it. They're holding close, let's say. So the enemy team is sort of holding close. There's two situations where their Mei is over here and their core is over here, right? That's one situation. The other situation is, we'll draw in green, is sort of their core is here, right? And maybe there is some other, maybe there is someone over here. That's not a Mei. Core plus Mei. Okay. So now, so we can scout, we can get that information, right? And now we're okay, we have this information. How do we deal with it? The first thing, let's talk about if they're stacked. Well, if they're stacked, right, then it's really straightforward, right? The biggest thing is all we need to do is when we're approaching this fight, we just need to understand that they're stacked and the Mei is stacked, right? We wall off their core and we push through, right? In this situation, it's still a bit scary because they could counter wall, right? So you just got to care of that. But you could wall through and then you could push, okay? And that way you're out of the choke, right? You don't want to be in here. At least in here, you're at a bit more space and you can push through. And I'll give a better way of dealing with this situation that I think is better in a second. But for instance, let's say you're in here, right? And you're pushing through here and their Mei's their whole team is over here, right? If you sort of wall them off, right, you can make this rotation and go in here. That's a better example, right? There's rotations you can make and that'll make you safe. And then from there, maybe you can come over here and then maybe go up top. If you can cross over, maybe you can do the wall over here, jump over here, wait to wait for your wall, or you can come back down and maybe do some other rotation, right? There's options, okay? But now if their Mei is not stacked, right, then normally what you want to do is you want to understand where their Mei is, okay? So the first thing, right, you could do, so it's now this example. The first thing you want to do is you want to know if you can wall off their Mei and their Mei can't counter wall. For instance, if their Mei is in this area here and you just wall off that Mei oh, well, it's actually, is it? Well, yeah, I was actually thinking might be a bit further back. I think it's over here actually. 1 minute. I think it's over here. Right, if their Mei's in there and you wall this, right? Then their Mei can't counter wall, somebody has to make a massive rotation, right? So then what you can do is you can just push through the choke and fight the team and take essentially a 6v5 and you can win, right? If their Mei sort of Eichenwald where their Mei can go to somewhere else, then that's probably not the best decision. What you could do is you could try and poke the Mei if possible and force cryo, but not very reliable, right? You could do the Diva Lucio push we talked about earlier, but also you have to care if you do the Diva Lucio push, you have to make sure that your core lives and for the 4v5 that they're going to take, and then your Diva Lucio get value on the Mei. Or, right, you could do something that's totally risky again. You could try and wall off the Mei, right, and push the core and do the 3-2-1. But all of these, right, my favorite, okay, in most situations, if there are rotation options, go for rotation plays, right? There is no reason to fight at this choke, right, if you don't have to, right? For the amount of times I see teams just run into this choke and just sort of just just waste time, right? Like, and just lose is crazy, right? I understand it takes time to rotate, but if you rotate and flip the map or do some like crazy stuff like that, you're forcing the enemy team to like deal with your tempo. You're forcing them to like understand that, like to understand, like, first of all, scout where you're going, right? And then match you, right? Most teams can't do that very fast. And then I'll go into something called rotation baiting in a second. Right. So for example, you could come into here, right? Go over here and then maybe like come all the way. Whoops. That's not right. Over here. Well, technically it's this, sorry. That, and then maybe you can drop like that and come behind them, right? You could go under, whoops, this is like, you could go here, 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 like come all the way here, flip the map, or you can go even further out, right? Like, and just flip the map, right? And go into like the defensive spawn. So you can do stuff like that, right? And like sort of make it crazy. But there's something else you can do that I think is really important to understand, and it's called rotation baiting. And what rotation baiting is whenever you rotate, sometimes the enemy team can't see you because you're out of their LOS, right? So for instance, we know the chokes here are here in mecha base, right? And the enemy team maybe holds like puts their core right over here. This is their core, right? And essentially what you can do is you can have your core, instead of push like this, you can essentially just say, okay, cool, we know they're there. I'm not going to bother with them. I'm going to look to go this way. And the enemy team is like, okay, they're going to the right side, right? Because they're scouting. So the enemy team that says, okay, they're going to the right side. Now we have to rotate. So then they might look to like come over, go over here. But then what you do is you don't use amp speed yet. You save speed. You only use speed when you're actually pushing, right? Or you're really close to them. So then you say, you know what? Nope, we're actually not going to go here. We're going to change our mind, and you can't see us, so you can't match us. And then you come back through here, and you catch them off guard. Okay. Another example of this that's very, very, that isn't as popular as it used to be, right? Is actually this. So a lot of times what teams would do here is they would, people would rotate through here and try and make this rotation. Okay. And the enemy team, right? Like what would happen is the blue would make a rotation and they'd wall somewhere over here to wall off the Mei. And then red would be like, okay, cool. They're going here. Now let's just come like over here or like over here and make them so they can't rotate. Right. But what would happen is the blue team would say, ha ha ha, you think we're actually going over here. We're actually not. Right. And they would stop right over here and they'd actually come back and push into the enemy team when they're in the middle of rotating. Right. So if you actually logistically think about this, what would happen is, because when you're rotating and you're doing stuff, you're essentially having the enemy team play to what you're doing, right? So if you're going here, they would stop here, okay? And when that happened, the enemy team would probably be roughly right over here, and they'd be expecting the enemy team to come this way, and they'd be like looking over here. Then this team would back up, right, and push into them, and they'd catch them off guard, right? And obviously the defending team could be like, oh, care them double backing, right? And like that's fine, and that's them being smart, right? But in general, it's still difficult for that to happen. Okay. Let's see here. So we talked about the example of a rotation bait, right? On King's Row, you can do the same thing too with high ground, where you can like, go all the way up here, make it look like maybe you're coming here, and then come maybe double back and like, I don't know, come over here. It's not the best one, but you could do it too. So yeah. The last one, right? Or another one you can sort of obviously do, right? If you don't really want to push through the choke in this situation, you could just use alts, right? Like if you have like ultimates and you can push through, you can just simply use alt and push through the choke, right? Like, and that works as well. Okay. Now let's say you don't have a Mei and they have a Mei, right? Like that, it's a little scary, right? But let's say you don't have a Mei and they have a Mei. How are you going to get through? Right. Well, it's a lot obvious now that it's a lot more obvious that like pushing through that choke is really scary because you have no way of counterwalling their Mei. Right. So the way to think about this is, okay, we can't push through the choke as easily. Right. Can we do something to split their focus? Is the first thing you should think about. Can we do something to split their focus or get some type of angles? And immediately when I think this, right, I immediately start thinking rotations. The rotation baits, right? Or just general rotations. Or I think, hey, do you have a Reaper? Can you sort of have a way where your core, right? Your core is pushing main, and then your Reaper sort of teleports behind here and then surprises them, from behind. Enemy team's playing here, right? The Reaper like pressures their backline. They all turn around for the Reaper. You push them in, right? Or the Reaper goes behind and like shoots the Mei, right? Forces cryo, and your team pushes forward, right? And it doesn't necessarily just have to be a Reaper, right? It could be any flanker essentially. It could like I like Reaper because it does a lot of damage, right? But it could be Reaper, it could be Tracer, it could be even Sombra, right? And the concept with like Reaper, right, is like you're gonna actually do damage to them, right? But let's say maybe the cart's over like here and the enemy team's holding close. Well, then you can also go have Tracer or Sombra go force point and force the enemy team to back up, right? And force them to get out of this choke. So that's another way of doing it, right? Is getting a flanker, right? Applying pressure, like I said with the Reaper, or forcing point and forcing them to back up. Okay. So again, if they don't have a Mei, if you don't have a Mei and you want to deal with this, right? Rotations is really good. Getting like a Reaper and trying to like maybe like get behind them and using angles and splitting focus with that. Getting like a Tracer or Sombra, forcing point, or just doing using ultimates, right? All of that will sort of work. Okay. Hopefully this helped a little bit with like understanding how to better hold chokes and with Mei. And even without, I guess you should still sort of get some stuff, right? And how to sort of push through chokes if you have a Mei or if you don't have a Mei.